Sir Richard, few people start with the intent of becoming an epidemiologist. I wonder if you could describe how your own path brought you to epidemiology.
Well, it was a series of fortunate flukes that did. I actually set off after my medical training with in the hope of becoming a brain surgeon and going for neurosurgery. But the war interrupted my plans for training, and by the time that was over, it was really too late to start on long periods of training in neurology and in surgery. And I'd always had an interest in mathematics and in the possibility of applying mathematics to medicine. And a friend of mine, who I may say subsequently became my wife, introduced me to Dr. Avery Jones, a gastroenterologist at the Central Middlesex Hospital, who was wanting an assistant in an epidemiological study of the etiology of peptic ulcer. And that seemed to me an excellent opportunity to break out from the standard medical experiences that one was having after the war, which you had to compete with lots of other people for very few jobs, and also gave me the opportunity of using perhaps mathematical skills. So I went to work with Avery Jones and did this study of the etiology of peptic ulcer, doing actually a survey in industry, trying to see how the incidence varied with people's hours of work, and in particular with night workers, day workers, shift workers, that sort of thing. During the course of that, I had the opportunity of taking this course in medical statistics at the London School of Hygiene, where I met Professor Bradford Hill, and after we'd finished our study on peptic ulcer, he asked me if I go and work with him in the study that he was about to set up to investigate the causes of lung cancer. So that's how I got into the field.
What would you say is the biggest difference between epidemiology as it was practiced when you started your own career and epidemiology as it is today?
Well, in the United Kingdom there really wasn't a subject of epidemiology when we started just after the war. There was a burgeoning subject of social medicine. A lot of young people, well, I exaggerate by saying a lot, quite a few young people had been very interested and concerned about social causes of disease, and after the war there had been, I think, 2 or possibly 3 departments of so-called social medicine set up in this country, which in effect turned into departments of epidemiology. But we were fortunate in that our secretary of our Medical Research Council was very sympathetic to this subject, to the idea that social and environmental factors might be important causes of disease. He set up a special social research unit under Jerry Morris at one of the London hospitals. There was Professor Ryle at Oxford, who had really first made social medicine an acceptable title in universities, but there weren't many senior people in the field, but there were opportunities for young people, and Archie Cochrane, myself and Jerry Morris, and a number of others, Donald Reed of course, we gathered round those few senior people who were interested in developing this subject, like Bradford Hill at the London School of Hygiene, and the whole world was open to us because there had been so relatively little exploration in this field at that time.
If you had to single out one person as having most strongly influenced your career, who would that be?
Well, there's no question about that, and that is Tony Bradford Hill. His actual name was Austin, but he was always known as Tony. He was the professor of medical statistics at the London School of Hygiene, but he was a Dr. Moncke. He had always wanted to be a doctor, but he got tuberculosis in the First World War and was unable to undertake the training, and so he gone into medical statistics under the guidance of Major Greenwood, who had been a friend of his father's, and he had become first reader and then subsequently professor of the subject at the school, at the London School of Hygiene. Now, he was a most remarkable man, professor of medical statistics without either a degree in medicine or in statistics, but he had an enormous interest in both subjects, and he had a genuine, deep interest in medical problems, and he always sought to have to learn medicine whenever he undertook a new subject. So but what of course one learnt particularly from him were two things, I think. One was the importance of the actual data that you were going to analyse. He didn't believe in sitting back and analysing other people's data. You really wanted to know what the validity of the data was that you were analysing, and it was the research worker's responsibility to have clean and reliable data. And then he said, you apply common sense to the analysis of the results. He didn't like any complex statistical techniques. He liked to be able to understand and explain in such a way that a non-statistical person could understand what was being done in his analyses of the data. And I think it was this emphasis on simplicity, on finding out the genuine medical importance of a problem, and on the validity of the data that you were using that were really the hallmarks of his teaching.
Collaboration is essential to successful epidemiologic studies. What have you personally found to be the most important ingredients of a good collaboration?
That everybody taking part in it should understand what the objective is and should be involved in what they're doing. You can't collaborate with people just by asking them to give you data or to make analyses or to collect data on your behalf. Collaboration means mutual trust in each other and an understanding of what the contribution from each person is going to be. I've been fortunate in the people I've been able to collaborate with over the years, from people like Michael Corp Brown, the radiobiologist, who was a person I'd happily talk about for an hour, a most extraordinary character. Avery Jones, the gastroenterologist, of course, Bradford Hill himself, Malcolm Pike, who came to work with me as a statistician, subsequently Richard Peto, an outstanding colleague, and then in the radiation field I had Sarah Darby to come to work. I worked with, and with all these people, I think one has worked on a level basis, that you all fully understand what the other's doing. You all got your part to play, and when you extend the collaboration out to many other people in other hospitals or in other units, the collaborators must be made to feel that they are essential members of the team and not just providers of data.
I wonder whom you'd regard as the most important epidemiologist during your lifetime.
Oh, again, I've no doubt it's Bradford Hill. He laid down so many principles which all his successors in England have tried to follow, the most important principle being the application of common sense and not formulae. I've stressed the importance he gave to the thorough understanding of all the data that goes into your material, and to the thorough understanding also of what you're doing with the numbers when you apply statistical techniques. It's not something you feed into a machine and get an answer come out the other end. You must know what's going on the whole time. But also, Bradford Hill stressed that problems should be tackled with, I said with common sense, but also thinking through the logical development. One shouldn't have formulae for dealing with things. The conclusion as to whether an association, observed association, was causal or not is one of the most important things you have to do, and one of the most difficult things an epidemiologist has to do. And to reach that conclusion needs continued application of logic, which needs new thought every time in relation to a new problem. I've said before, he taught one not to use the automatic application of formulae were not the correct way to solve problems. Each problem has to be tackled through a thorough understanding of its nature and working out what is the most direct and simplest way of achieving the answer that you are looking for.
Thinking now of your own work, which do you think has been your most influential paper?
Well, I think one has to say the doctor's follow-up study, which we obtained smoking histories from some 40,000 British doctors, 34,000 males, and we followed them actually for 50 years with periodically new information about changes in their habits. I've just completed the study last year, but I think it was the most influential because it revealed so many surprises. It didn't just confirm findings on smoking and lung cancer from a case control study, although that was considered very important by many outsiders. Our own view was that the case control study had produced sufficiently clear evidence, but what it showed quite surprisingly was that there were so many other diseases that were caused by smoking, and it continued to produce new information over 30 or 40 years, because it's shown how prolonged cigarette smoking from early in life produces a much greater effect than one suspected from early observations, where often the cigarette smoker was someone who'd smoked a pipe for the first 10 or 20 years of his life, or chewed tobacco, or smoked cigars. It's the regular smoking of cigarettes which were much more hazardous than other tobacco products over a long period that was most dangerous. And the doctors' cohort, which was continued for 50 years, did demonstrate this very clearly. Of course, there have been the enormous studies in America with much bigger numbers, which have shown the same things, but certainly I would say that study are the ones that I've had privilege to take part in, has been the most important.
And of course it's been very well appreciated throughout the world. But at the other end of the spectrum, what do you think has been your most underappreciated paper?
Well, my favourite paper was the one with Court Brown on working out the dose-response relationship between radiation and leukemia. And it wouldn't be fair to say it was not appreciated, because the Medical Research Council, which asked us to carry out the study, and another number of other people were very interested in our result and took it seriously. But I don't think if you asked many epidemiologists to associate any particular observations with my work, that they would pick on the dose-response relationship between radiation and leukemia. And yet, in a way, it was certainly the second most important work I've done, other than the effect of smoking, because it provided the first, not conclusive by any means, but suggestive evidence of a linear relationship down to quite small doses, and did provide an estimate of risk from unit dose of radiation, which is actually not very different from the one that is accepted now. And it was quite a difficult study to organise. We had to collect information on 14,000 patients treated throughout the country by radiotherapy for a benign condition, ankylosing spondylitis, and we had to measure the dose of radiation received in the marrow by doing experiments on a model man. I think it was in many ways it was the best designed, and I think the best work really that I've ever participated in. But it's be unfair to say it's not appreciated at all, because it was one of the things that was mentioned by the United Nations when I got the United Nations Award for Cancer Research, but it's not often recognised nowadays, I don't think.
It was published by the Medical Research Council in a report, but was it also published elsewhere in a journal?
No, it was never published in a journal. All the important information was just published in a Medical Research Council report.
And do you think that mechanism of publication might have played a role in people not appreciating it, in the sense that it's quite hard to get hold of that report now?
Yes, I think that probably is the case.
I wonder, in the future, which of your many contributions to the field you would most like to be remembered for?
Well, I think I would have to say the effect of smoking, because it has been so important. Although I have to admit to a certain amount of boredom in the subject myself, yet no, I would most like to be remembered for that.
Now, you've clearly spent most of your life doing epidemiology, but what have been your major interests outside your epidemiologic activities?
Well, my home, I suppose, really. I've been interested in literature. I've been interested in the theatre. I haven't had anything you'd call hobbies. My work has taken up most of my time in the evenings, I think. But I've enjoyed gardening. I've enjoyed travel greatly. I've enjoyed literature and the theatre. And I've greatly enjoyed home life.
Am I right in thinking that your Who's Who entry gives food and conversation as your outside interests?
Yes, it does. You are right in remembering that, and certainly they are two things which I still greatly enjoy, but I don't know that I want to be remembered for having picked those out as my main interests.
Going back to work, what elements of an epidemiologist's working environment do you think are most essential for a productive career?
the possibility of collaboration is certainly vital. Nowadays, of course, the access to computers and knowledge of computer programming is so important, whereas it was non-existent in my time. But collaboration with medical people who know what are the real major problems in the world, I think is most important for an epidemiologist. Of course, it's becoming increasingly difficult to solve problems of etiology nowadays by epidemiological methods. The easy things have all been done, but I'm certain there still remain many problems which can be solved, but you need to collaborate with the specialists in those fields to solve them. But close contact with the realities of day-to-day medicine, I think, is, I believe, still to be the most important thing for an epidemiologist.
In your opinion, what has been epidemiology's most important contribution to society as a whole?
I don't think there's ever been anything as important as Snow's discovery of fecal contamination of water causing cholera. This led to the discovery really of all waterborne diseases and the prevention of an enormous amount of ill health throughout the world. I don't think anything is ever compared with that, and all the lessons of it have yet to be put into effect.
What would your assessment be of the current state of health of epidemiology?
In the UK, it's not very good. The criteria that are laid down now for advancement in one's various categories, from junior to through being an assistant to being a consultant or a professor, are very difficult for an epidemiologist to progress through in England, particularly because of the way that salaries are determined, and the need, if you're medically qualified, to get classified as a consultant. There are so many bureaucratic obstacles now to the just studying epidemiology per se, as I was fortunate enough to be able to do without having to worry about the necessary steps to get the next grade up in the profession. Universities too have got so enthralled with molecular genetics that senior medical people are tending to relegate epidemiology to a very minor corner of medical schools, and I think this is an error, because molecular genetics is still going to require the epidemiological observations to determine what are the exposures that are important causes of human disease.
And what would you say are the biggest risks that our profession faces at the moment?
Well, one risk to my mind is becoming over-statistical and thinking that everything can be solved by means of computers. And there is, I've seen it, I'm sure all epidemiologists have, young people applying complex statistical formulae without really understanding what is going on in the in the modelling that produces the result that they end up with. I think this is one of the greatest hazards in epidemiology at the present moment.
Would you see the increasing difficulty in getting access to data through confidentiality as a risk as well?
Indeed, yes. I should have put that first. The enormous change in the, I won't say public attitude so much as governmental attitude, because I'm not sure that the public really are as concerned as governments have appeared to be as a result of the effect of pressure groups over confidentiality. But when I started in epidemiology, we still operated on the old system, which was approved by the Medical Research Council, that a doctor could pass information about a patient to another doctor, relying on Hippocratic oath of treating details about patients confidentially outside the profession. And we had no difficulty in collecting all sorts of information as long as it was covered by some medical man taking responsibility. Now, and I say covered by because quite often the statisticians would be actually handling the data, but in order to meet the conditions at the time, you had to have a medical person taking a responsibility on the basis of the Hippocratic Oath, and it worked. I know of no trouble having been caused to anybody by the free passage of information between clinicians and epidemiologists in the study of disease. Now it is becoming horrifyingly difficult to get hold of a lot of information that you need, and I can see great difficulties for the epidemiologists of the future. I didn't immediately react that way when you spoke about it, because I find it's so depressing that I have suppressed it in my mind. And personally, it won't affect me, as I shan't be doing research in 10 years' time. But it really is being made extremely difficult, if not in many cases impossible.
On a more optimistic note, what would you see as the ripest opportunities in epidemiology at the moment?
I don't think at my age I'd like to predict what that is.
Well, my next question is also about prediction. It's to ask whether you had any predictions about what the future may hold for our field, in addition, of course, to what you've already said.
I've given up predicting the future for many years. I've nearly always been wrong, except in the case of the necessity of a war with Hitler Germany in the 1930s, when those young people like myself saw the horrors of what was going on in Germany, and we realized there was no alternative. But most of my other predictions have turned out to be incorrect.
As my final question, I'd like to ask you what would be the most important piece of advice you could give to a new epidemiologist starting out on a career?
I've no doubt in my mind what the most important thing for them to do is, and that is to get attached to a good epidemiological unit, and preferably the best one there is in the country. He's going to learn from the practice of seeing what's done by his colleagues, and he or she must are going to learn that most easily by working with the best epidemiologists. So go for the top, I would say to the young epidemiologist, and work with the best people. That's the best thing you can do.
Sir Richard Dole, thank you very much.